This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. The sun had barely risen over the sleepy university town in Florida, casting a pale orange light over the palm trees and the whitewashed buildings that stood as silent witnesses to the subtle shifts of life within their walls. It was the kind of town where nothing seemed to happen, where the breeze always carried the scent of salt and the faintest whisper of a distant ocean, and where students meandered through their days, unaware of the darkening storm that was brewing just beneath the surface. Layla, Amina, Zara, and Fatima had arrived at the university several months ago, each from a different part of the Muslim world. They were strangers to this place, to this culture, yet they found themselves brought together by a shared sense of isolation. On the outside, they were ordinary students, just like the others, clad in jeans, backpacks slung over their shoulders, their hair pulled back into neat ponytails, their faces marked with the subtle stress of midterms and assignments. But beneath their outward appearances, there were scars that had not yet fully healed, scars that no one could see, but scars that shaped every thought, every action, every breath they took. Layla had come from Cairo, her life once filled with dreams of becoming a doctor, of helping people, of making a difference. But the world she had left behind was one of growing instability, where the whispers of political unrest and religious division echoed through every street. The decision to leave had been both an escape and a form of self-preservation. America, with its promise of opportunity and safety, had seemed like the perfect place to start anew. But now, several months later, the glitter of that promise had begun to fade. She felt the sting of being an outsider more acutely than ever. Her accent marked her as foreign. Her hijab, though simple, had become a symbol of separation, an object of suspicion. The stares from classmates, the questions from professors, the awkward pauses in conversations, these were the daily reminders that no matter how hard she tried to fit in, she would always be different. And it was a difference that seemed to intensify the longer she stayed. Amina had come from the heart of Yemen, her face a soft mask of serenity that hid the storm of emotions inside her. She was the idealist, the dreamer. She had arrived in Florida with a heart full of hope, convinced that in this new world people could look past their differences and find common ground. She believed that education was the key to bridging the chasm between cultures, that if people could only understand one another, then the world could be a better place. But the reality was much harsher than the dream she had carried with her. The first time she had stepped into an American classroom, she had been met with an unsettling silence, the kind of silence that came when something foreign was introduced into an otherwise homogeneous environment. Her classmates had smiled politely, but there was an undercurrent of unease, something unspoken, a knowledge that she didn't quite belong. She had hoped that over time, the whispers would fade, but instead they had only grown louder. There were moments when she would sit in the campus library, surrounded by students who seemed to be so at home in their surroundings, and she would feel a deep ache in her chest, as if she were an intruder in a place that was never meant for her. Zara, on the other hand, had come from Pakistan with a different purpose in mind. She was pragmatic, driven by a desire to succeed, to prove herself. The American dream had always seemed like a distant ideal, something to aspire to but never quite attainable. She had come to Florida not because she believed in the myth of American freedom, but because she knew that in this world success was measured by what you could achieve, not where you came from. She had expected difficulty, but nothing had prepared her for the subtle, insidious form of prejudice that seeped into every interaction. It wasn't the overt racism that you could confront head-on, it was something quieter, more insidious. It was the raised eyebrows when she spoke, the unspoken judgment that hung in the air when she entered a room, the uncomfortable silence that followed her every word. She had learned to ignore it, to bury it beneath her ambition, to tell herself that success would be her revenge. But the bitterness had begun to grow inside her, twisting in ways she didn't fully understand. Then there was Fatima, the quiet one, the one who always seemed to be in the background, her dark eyes watching, calculating. Fatima's story was different from the others. She hadn't come to America by choice, her family had sent her, desperate to escape the political turmoil that was tearing their homeland apart. She had no dreams of becoming a doctor or a scientist, no idealistic notions of changing the world. Fatima's life had been one of survival, and survival had taught her how to blend in, how to disappear into the shadows, how to observe without being seen. It wasn't that she didn't have a voice, she did, but it had been silenced by years of trauma, by years of fighting just to exist in a world that had never cared about her. In Florida, Fatima had become a ghost. She wandered through the halls of the university like a specter, drifting from class to class, never really connecting with anyone. She didn't care about fitting in or being accepted. She was just waiting for something, anything that would give her a reason to stop feeling so numb. At first, the four women had been drawn together by the simplest of things: shared meals, shared classes, the unspoken recognition that they were all strangers in this place. They spent their evenings together, sitting in small, dimly lit apartments, nursing cups of tea and talking about their homes, their families, the lives they had left behind. The bond between them had been formed out of necessity, a fragile thread woven from the isolation they felt in the outside world. They didn't need to speak much; each of them knew what the others were going through. There was a quiet understanding between them, a silent acknowledgement that they were all living in a world that didn't quite belong to them. But as the weeks passed, the nature of their bond began to change. Layla, who had once been the optimistic leader, began to show a darker side. She started to talk more about the injustices she had faced, about the way the world had treated her, about the betrayal she felt in the face of her own helplessness. Her frustration grew with every passing day, and the words she spoke became sharper, more accusatory. Amina, who had once been the voice of hope, began to retreat inwardly, unsure of how to reconcile the idealistic visions of peace and unity she had carried with the reality she now faced. Zara's ambition turned to bitterness as the weight of the discrimination she encountered each day began to take its toll. And Fatima, the quiet one, began to withdraw even further, her eyes growing colder, more distant, as if something deep within her had shifted, and she no longer cared to fight against the feeling of being invisible. The university was a microcosm of the world they lived in, a world that was divided, polarized, and increasingly hostile. They had come to this place seeking refuge, seeking opportunity, seeking a better life. But what they had found was not the promise of freedom, but a mirror that reflected everything they feared, everything they hated. They had come to Florida seeking peace, but what they found was only the quiet rumblings of a storm, one that had been building for months, one that no one could have predicted, but one that was now impossible to ignore. In the days that followed, there were no dramatic confrontations, no shouting matches, no overt signs of the violence that was to come. But beneath the surface, the women began to change. Each of them carried the weight of their own internal battle, their own private war, and the tension began to build. It was a slow burn, a creeping sense of doom that settled into the pit of their stomachs, a feeling that something terrible was about to happen, but none of them could quite bring themselves to acknowledge it. The calm before the storm was not a tranquil peace; it was a quiet, suffocating stillness, a moment of fragile calm before the inevitable chaos would erupt. And none of them knew, not yet, that they had already crossed a line from which there would be no return. It began subtly, like a crack in a wall that at first seemed insignificant, a small, almost imperceptible shift in the air, a thought whispered in the dark corners of their minds. But cracks over time grow deeper and wider, and what once seemed harmless soon became an uncontrollable force. The spark, once flickering quietly in the shadows of their frustrations, slowly grew into something much darker, much more dangerous. For Layla, it started with a simple question: why are we here? The question was whispered to herself late one night, in the quiet of her small, sparsely furnished apartment. She had long since grown tired of the loneliness that clung to her like a second skin, but what gnawed at her more was the feeling that no matter how much she tried, no matter how many textbooks she read or lectures she attended, she would never truly belong in this world. She had come to America, to Florida, with the dream of escaping the chaos she had left behind in Cairo, to build a new life for herself. She had imagined that here she could find peace, opportunity, a place where she could thrive and become who she was meant to be. But the world she had encountered was indifferent, cold, and inhospitable, a world that didn't understand her, that saw her as nothing more than an outsider. The feeling of betrayal, of being cast aside, of being ignored and misunderstood had begun to fester inside her. She had tried to push it down, to convince herself that the struggles she faced were temporary, that things would get better if she just worked harder, tried harder, proved herself. But as the weeks turned into months, the frustration grew, and so did her resentment. Every time she was passed over for a job because of her accent, every time her hijab attracted unwanted stares, every time she was treated as less than human, something inside her hardened. Layla had always been a dreamer, but now her dreams felt hollow. The ideals of education, progress, and understanding that she had once held dear began to crumble before her eyes. America, the land of opportunity, had become a cage, and she was a prisoner in it. She began to seek answers in places she hadn't considered before. What if everything she had been taught, everything she had believed in, was a lie? What if the world wasn't as fair as they said it was? What if there was something more, a hidden truth, a larger picture that she wasn't seeing? One night, Layla stumbled across an online forum, a dark corner of the internet where disillusioned individuals like her gathered. They spoke in hushed, angry tones, their words charged with an energy she hadn't encountered before. The forum was a place where people vented their frustrations, where they discussed their growing sense of alienation and betrayal. But it wasn't just a space for catharsis, it was a place where ideas were planted, where the seeds of something darker were sown. Layla found herself drawn to the content, to the videos, to the stories of those who had turned their backs on everything they had been taught. These people had embraced something new, something that promised power, revenge, and justice. As she read more, as she consumed the rhetoric of the radicals, Layla's worldview shifted. She felt an electric jolt of recognition as the words on the screen seemed to speak directly to her, to the anger that simmered just beneath her skin. She wasn't the only one. Others, many others, felt the same way, betrayed, rejected, cast aside by a world that didn't care about them. The voices in her head that whispered doubts and questions were no longer whispers. They were roars, demanding to be heard, demanding action. Layla's mind became consumed by the idea that she had been wrong all along. America wasn't the promised land. It was a trap. She wasn't the only one who felt this way. The others, the women she had come to know and depend on, were changing too. Amina, once the brightest light in their small circle, had grown quiet and withdrawn. She no longer spoke about the possibilities of unity and understanding that had once inspired her. Instead, she would sit in silence, her eyes hollow, as if she were searching for something she couldn't find. Layla had once looked to Amina as the embodiment of hope, the one who reminded them all that there was still good in the world. But now Amina seemed lost, adrift, unable to reconcile the ideals of peace she had once held so dearly with the world she saw around her. Layla could see it in Amina's eyes, the same fire, the same hunger for something more. But Amina was no longer interested in hope. She was interested in something else. Zara, too, had begun to change. Her ambition had always been sharp, a laser focus on her future, on what she could accomplish in this strange land. But the more she encountered the subtle bigotry of those around her, the more she realized that the success she sought would never be hers. Her skin was too dark, her accent too thick, her beliefs too foreign. Zara had spent years believing that if she just worked hard enough, if she just proved her worth, she would be accepted. But that was a lie. America didn't want her. The American system didn't care about her. The dream of success had become a cruel joke, a mirage that was always just out of reach. The frustration that had once driven her now fueled a cold, burning anger. She wasn't going to be a passive victim anymore. She would take what was hers. She would take it by force. Fatima, the quiet one, had always been a mystery. She had never shared much about herself, never opened up to the others in the same way they had. But now something in her was shifting, something darker and more dangerous. Fatima had always kept her pain hidden, buried deep inside her, a quiet echo of the violence and trauma she had experienced in her homeland. But that pain, that constant ache of being unseen, unheard, and unwanted, had turned to something else. Fatima was tired of pretending, tired of being a shadow in a place that never cared to see her. The numbness she had lived with for so long had transformed into something sharp and deadly. She didn't care about finding answers anymore. She cared about taking control. She cared about making the world feel her presence, making them pay for what they had done to her. Together, the four women began to speak more openly about their feelings, their frustrations, their anger. They began to share their experiences with one another, finding in each other a sense of solidarity that they had never found elsewhere. They began to feed off each other's pain, each other's rage. They were no longer four individuals struggling to survive in a foreign land. They were a collective force, bound together by a shared hatred for the world that had rejected them, a shared desire to make it pay. And it was during one of these late-night conversations, as they sat around a small table littered with empty teacups and half-read books, that the idea was first whispered, a quiet, terrifying idea that would change everything. What if they could do something more than just survive? What if they could make the world feel their anger, their pain, their betrayal? What if they could show the world that they would no longer be invisible, that they would no longer be ignored? The seed was planted, and from that moment there was no turning back. The spark of radicalization had caught fire, and the women, bound by their collective resentment, began to chart a new course, one that would lead them down a dark, unforgiving path. As the months dragged on, the subtle frustrations of everyday life began to warp and solidify into something far more dangerous. What had started as individual isolation and bitterness slowly fused into a shared, consuming force that neither of the four women could escape. What began as a personal wound, a quiet ache of rejection and alienation, now became a violent thirst for retribution. Layla, Amina, Zara, and Fatima no longer saw themselves as the powerless victims of a foreign world. They had become something else, something darker, more dangerous. They were not just angry. They were hungry. Hungry for justice. Hungry for revenge. Hungry to make a world that had forgotten them remember their names, remember their pain. It was Layla who first voiced the thought, her words crawling into the air like a snake, sleek and venomous. She had come to the realization that nothing would change unless they made it change, unless they took control of their own narrative. The idea was terrifying, but in the silence of their small apartment, it felt inevitable. They would strike. The time for quiet suffering was over. The injustice, the betrayal they had endured, it would not be forgotten. But this time, it would not be a protest. This time, it would be an execution. The four women spent weeks that felt like years gathering their courage, their resources, and most importantly, their resolve. The plan was meticulously crafted, every detail scrutinized, every action anticipated. They knew the risks, knew the consequences. But they also knew, deep down, that this was no longer about revenge. This was about creating a legacy, about making sure their names would be remembered long after their bodies had turned to dust. Layla was the one who took the lead. She was the most vocal, the one whose anger had festered the longest. Her mind had been consumed by the ideology she had found online, the radical voices that had whispered to her in the dark. It had started innocently enough, just an article here, a video there, but soon the rabbit hole had swallowed her whole. The more she learned, the more she believed. It wasn't just about her own suffering anymore. It was about every wrong that had been done to her friends, to every person who had ever felt forgotten. This was about them all. They didn't talk about the details at first, but it was clear to everyone that the magnitude of their plan had only grown with each passing day. They would not just target the system. They would target the heart of it, the students. They would show them what it meant to be invisible, to be unwanted. And in the process, they would burn the memory of their lives into the public consciousness. The venue was decided almost immediately. There was a party scheduled at one of the largest student halls on campus, an annual event that was always packed with hundreds of students. It was a place where the walls seemed to hum with a false sense of safety, where the laughter and music drowned out the world outside, but it would become their battleground. The women had been to this venue before, seen the students laughing, dancing, completely unaware of the darkness just outside their circle. They knew it was the perfect place, the perfect time. It started with gathering supplies. The weapons, explosives, the intricate details of how to get everything past security, it was all part of a growing web of planning that stretched across the weeks. At first, they only spoke in hushed tones, their words so quiet that they barely dared to listen to each other. It was as if the very act of discussing it out loud would solidify the horror they were about to unleash. But as the plan took shape, as each step became clearer, there was a sick thrill in the air, a palpable tension that bound them together. It was no longer fear that held them in place. It was something darker, something that drove them to continue. Zara, ever the pragmatist, took charge of the technicalities. She was the one who knew how to make things work. The others might have been driven by anger, but Zara's mind was sharp with purpose. She had always been able to solve problems, to break things down and reassemble them into something usable. She took it upon herself to acquire the materials they needed for the explosives, scouring the corners of the internet, and seeking out connections that would provide her with the tools of destruction. She didn't care about the danger. She didn't care about the lives of the people who might get caught in the blast. For her, this wasn't about the destruction of property. This was about the destruction of a system. This was about showing everyone who had ever looked down on her, ignored her, tried to break her, that she was not weak. She would not be passive anymore. Fatima's role was more subtle. She was the one who gathered information, the one who stayed in the shadows and observed. She had always been the quiet one, the one who slipped under the radar. But that had been her advantage. While the others had spent their time figuring out the larger picture, Fatima observed the smaller details, the routines of the students, the vulnerabilities in the security system, the patterns of behavior. She knew that this had to be perfect. There could be no mistakes. Fatima was the one who knew how to remain unseen, how to blend in, how to make sure that everything went according to plan without drawing attention to herself. Amina, whose spirit had once been the most optimistic, now found herself trapped in the suffocating grip of disillusionment. The idealism that had once driven her was gone, replaced by a cold, empty clarity. She didn't know how it had happened. One day she had simply woken up and realized that the world wasn't going to change. People weren't going to suddenly understand her. They would never see her as anything but an outsider. She couldn't fix it, couldn't change it. The only thing she could do was watch it burn. Amina wasn't interested in the technicalities. She didn't want to know the specifics of the plan. All she needed to know was that it would happen and that she would be there. She would carry out her part without hesitation, without remorse. As the night of the party drew closer, the four women became more and more afraid. There were moments of panic, moments of doubt, but those feelings were fleeting. They were quickly drowned out by the rising tide of certainty, the knowledge that they had come too far, had sacrificed too much to turn back now. The plan was set. It would happen. On the night of the party, the women dressed in their most inconspicuous clothes, blending in as if they were just like everyone else. They didn't stand out, didn't draw attention to themselves. They moved through the crowd as if they belonged. They were faceless, nameless. They were nobody, and yet they were about to make sure that the world would never forget them. The explosive devices were hidden, concealed in backpacks and under clothing, carefully disguised and timed to perfection. The women had rehearsed every movement, every step, 1,000 times. They knew what they had to do. They moved to their designated positions, each one of them finding a place that would maximize the destruction, the chaos. Layla felt her heart pounding in her chest, the adrenaline building to a fever pitch, but there was no fear. There was only purpose. There was only the knowing that this was it, that this was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment that would change everything. The clock ticked closer to the appointed time. The music thumped in the background, the lights flickering with the beat, the crowd unaware of the impending disaster. And then, at the signal, the chaos erupted. The explosion was deafening. The shockwave sent bodies flying and screams filled the air. The night that had started as a celebration would end as a massacre, a moment of terror that would rip through the campus and beyond. As the dust settled, as the smoke curled into the night air, the women disappeared into the shadows. They had done what they set out to do. The world would never forget, and neither would they. The night began like any other. The rhythmic thud of music pulsed through the walls of the student hall, mixing with the excited hum of young voices. It was an annual celebration, a tradition that had grown over the years, a night for students to unwind, to let loose. The hall, decorated in bright, dizzying colors, glittered under the flashing lights. People mingled in groups, their laughter sharp and carefree. But underneath the festive facade, the air was thick with tension, suffocating in its anticipation. There was something different about this night, something that no one in the room could see, something that was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to explode. Layla stood at the edge of the crowd, her heart pounding like a war drum in her chest. She was dressed in simple, dark clothing, nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would make her stand out. She blended in effortlessly with the sea of faces, her eyes scanning the crowd, her every movement deliberate, calculated. She had done this 100 times in her mind, rehearsed every step, every breath. The plan had been set into motion, and now there was no turning back. The pieces were in place. The devices were hidden. The time had come. The music throbbed around her, the beat of the bass vibrating in her bones. It should have been comforting, familiar. It should have been a moment of release, of freedom. But to Layla, it was only a reminder of the lives that would soon be lost, of the chaos she was about to unleash. Her mind was consumed with a singular, all-encompassing thought: it had to happen. There could be no mercy, no second-guessing. This was their moment of reckoning. The others were scattered across the hall, their movements as seamless as her own. They were there, too silent, unseen. Amina was near the center of the crowd, her back straight, her face an unreadable mask. Zara was further back, watching with an intensity that seemed to cut through the noise. Fatima was already near the exit, her eyes darting over the room, scanning for anything that could go wrong. Each woman was a thread in a web that was tightening with every passing second. They were invisible to the others, but they could feel each other's presence, could sense the shift in the air. Everything was falling into place. Layla's eyes flicked to the clock on the wall, 10 minutes to go. The world was still turning in its usual way, oblivious to the horrors that were about to unfold. She couldn't help but notice the students laughing, the couples dancing, the groups of friends who had no idea that in mere moments their lives would be forever altered. It disgusted her, how easy it was for them to forget, to live in their bubble of privilege while people like her and the others around her were crushed under the weight of their own invisibility. They lived their lives as if everything would remain the same, as if nothing ever truly changed. But it would. A feeling of cold, almost eerie clarity washed over her. There was no more fear, only resolve. It was as if time itself had slowed down, as if the whole world had paused for a moment, holding its breath before the inevitable. The chaos, the bloodshed, the pain, it was all part of the plan. Every inch of her body screamed in protest against what she was about to do, but the anger was louder than any moral hesitation. The room felt suffocating now. The music, once a steady beat, now felt dissonant, grating on her nerves. The flashing lights danced erratically, casting wild shadows on the walls. She took a deep breath, her fingers curling into tight fists at her sides. Her heart was still pounding, but it was no longer fear that drove it. It was something else, something raw and primal, something that surged through her veins like molten fire. It was anger, and it was about to be unleashed. She moved toward the center of the room, her feet moving with purpose, her eyes locked onto the spot where everything would begin. In the crowd, no one took notice of her approach. She was just another face in the crowd, another student attending another party. No one knew that she was the spark that would set the world on fire. Then, without warning, it happened. The first explosion was deafening, a violent roar that shattered the air and ripped through the walls. The sound was so intense that it felt as if the very ground beneath them was cracking open. The floor buckled, the ceiling trembled, and the lights flickered violently. The deafening blast was followed by a wave of heat that seemed to melt the very air around them, turning it thick and suffocating. For a split second, everything stopped, everything went silent. But then the screaming began. A high-pitched, soul-ripping sound that clawed its way through the air, echoing against the walls, drowning out the chaos. The crowd, which had been laughing just moments before, was now in full panic. People scattered, running in every direction, tripping over one another, pushing and shoving as they tried to escape the onslaught of destruction. The room was engulfed in chaos, a feverish, desperate scramble for safety. But there was nowhere to hide. The exits were blocked. The windows were too high. And even if they could escape, what would they be escaping to? The explosion had already ripped apart the facade of their safety. There was no escape from the nightmare that had been unleashed. Layla felt the force of the blast reverberate through her body, her chest tightening as the weight of the moment crashed down on her. But there was no time for hesitation. She forced herself to keep moving, to focus on her task, to carry out the plan. The fire that was raging inside her, the need for retribution, kept her going. She moved through the crowd like a phantom, unnoticed, unseen. She could hear the screams, the sounds of bodies crashing to the floor, the sickening thud of feet stumbling over the dead and dying. It was chaos, pure and unrelenting. It was everything she had hoped for. As she made her way to the back of the hall, her mind didn't linger on the bodies that littered the floor, the blood that began to stain the walls, or the screams of those who were trapped. No, she had a singular goal. She had to make sure that the next wave of devastation was set into motion. She found her place, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the next signal. The second explosion detonated with the same brutal force. It sent shards of metal and debris flying in every direction, cutting through the crowd like a storm of knives. The air was thick with smoke, the acrid scent of burning flesh mixing with the stench of fear and death. It was impossible to breathe. The room was now a furnace of destruction, and the screams became a chorus of horror. People fell over each other, trampling those who were already down, desperate to escape but unable to find any way out. The pain, the terror, the agony, it was all around them. But through it all, Layla moved with cold precision, never once faltering, never once slowing down. Fatima's role was coming to fruition now. She had positioned herself by the back door, just as planned, her eyes cold and focused. The moment the explosion had gone off, she had disappeared into the smoke, blending into the chaos. She had always been the one who could hide in plain sight, and now that skill proved invaluable. She was the quiet hand in the background, making sure the final steps of the plan went without a hitch. The third explosion came with such force that the building itself seemed to shake to its foundations. The walls cracked, and the ceiling began to buckle under the weight of the destruction. The screams reached a crescendo, a cacophony of pain that filled the air, mingling with the sound of collapsing concrete and shattering glass. The world had descended into a nightmare, a world where the only reality was terror. Amina and Zara moved as one, their faces set in grim determination. Amina, always so composed, was now a woman possessed, her movements sharp and deadly. Zara, with her unyielding focus, carried out her part with the same precision she had applied to everything in her life. They were all moving like shadows now, their presence barely felt in the midst of the madness, but they were there and their work was far from finished. The hall was a war zone, the air thick with smoke and blood. The flashing lights of the emergency alarms blinked in the distance, a cruel mockery of the help that would never come in time. The party had become a slaughterhouse, the students reduced to nothing more than victims in a grand design they could never have anticipated. As Layla watched the chaos unfold around her, her chest constricted. The satisfaction was there, but so was something else, a hollow, cold emptiness. She had done it. They had done it. But in the aftermath, as the walls of the building trembled and the last screams echoed in her ears, she felt only the gnawing certainty that this, too, would not bring the peace she had imagined. The aftermath of that night unfolded slowly, painfully, as the world tried to comprehend what had just been unleashed. The early hours were filled with confusion, disbelief, and a deep, gnawing horror. News reports flooded in from every corner of the country, each one more graphic, more chilling than the last. Images of twisted metal, blood-soaked floors, and the haunted faces of survivors, stunned into silence, dominated the screens. The scale of the attack was incomprehensible, but the impact it had on the collective psyche of the nation was immediate and profound. For days, the world would be consumed by the tragedy, trying to piece together what had happened, why it had happened, and who was responsible. The media frenzy began almost instantly. Cable news stations ran live coverage, replaying grainy footage from security cameras that showed the chaos, the explosions, the destruction, and the haunting faces of the victims. Reporters scrambled to uncover every shred of information they could find, every scrap of evidence that could explain why this had happened. As the death toll rose, so did the desperation to understand the cause. The first responders, those brave enough to enter the shattered hall, found themselves standing in the midst of what could only be described as hell on earth. The bodies of the dead and dying were strewn across the floor, their faces frozen in expressions of horror and confusion. The air was thick with smoke, with the stench of burning flesh, the acrid bite of gunpowder. The noise, the dissonance, was deafening even in its absence. The survivors, if they could be called that, wandered in a daze, lost, broken, desperate to escape the memory of what had just happened. In the days that followed, the questions began. How had this been possible? What had caused such a brutal, unthinkable attack on young people? The authorities, in the face of such devastation, struggled to put together any coherent answers. There were no obvious suspects, no clear motives, just the devastating consequences of a well-planned, perfectly executed act of violence. But as they began to sift through the wreckage, both physical and emotional, a few chilling truths began to emerge. It didn't take long for the authorities to discover that the attack had been carefully orchestrated. The bombs, 3 in total, had been placed with methodical precision, designed to cause maximum destruction, to create as much panic and death as possible. Whoever had carried out the attack had known exactly what they were doing, had anticipated every movement, every reaction, and had executed the plan flawlessly. But beyond the technical details of the explosions, there was another, more unsettling reality. The 4 women responsible for the carnage were, in many ways, invisible. The investigation into their identities revealed that they had lived quiet lives, unnoticed by most of the world, existing on the fringes of society. They were women who had been swallowed up by a world that had no place for them, victims of a system that had failed them, but they had, in turn, become something far more dangerous. They had found each other, bound by a shared sense of alienation, by a collective rage that no one had ever bothered to understand. The search for answers quickly morphed into an intense scrutiny of their lives, of their histories, their families, their connections. It was clear that this wasn't just a random act of violence. There was a purpose behind it, something that went deeper than the surface of their lives. The authorities dug into their pasts, pulling apart every detail, trying to unravel the threads that connected them to one another, to the ideology that had driven them to this point. The women, despite their careful planning, had left behind fragments, small pieces of a puzzle that, when put together, painted a chilling picture. Layla, the one who had pulled everything together, had spent years immersing herself in online communities that preached radical ideas, in spaces that condemned the very world that had cast her aside. Her anger had simmered for so long, festering in the dark corners of her mind, that it had finally consumed her entirely. Amina, too, had fallen into the same abyss, though hers had been a quieter descent, a slow and steady disillusionment with the world that had never accepted her. Zara, the pragmatic one, had always been calculating, always precise, and it was in her sharpness that the plan had taken its most deadly form. Fatima, the shadow among them, had been the one to watch, the one who had quietly slipped into their midst and helped pull the plan together in ways that no one else could have. They had all been driven by something, a force more powerful than just simple anger or grief. They had been driven by a shared sense of invisibility, by the conviction that they would never be seen as equals, as human beings. They had found their power in the act of violence, in the destruction of a system that had left them to rot in its margins. As the investigation continued, the authorities uncovered more about the women's connections to one another. They had been in the same circles, had met online, had come together in their shared belief that the world owed them something, that they were entitled to take back what had been taken from them. They had been radicalized not just by a political ideology, but by something deeper, more personal. Each woman had been scarred by the rejection of a world that had never been kind to them, that had never given them a place to stand. But that rejection, that pain, had twisted into something far darker, something far more dangerous. It was as if the world had abandoned them, and in turn, they had abandoned everything that had ever made them human. The media, in its frenzy to understand what had happened, began to latch onto every detail they could find. They labeled the attack as an act of terrorism, but the term felt hollow in the face of what had truly transpired. It wasn't just about political ideology. It wasn't just about religion or race. It was about something far more primal, the need to be seen, to be heard, to matter. The women had made a statement, and the world was listening, but in the worst way possible. As the death toll continued to rise, and more bodies were discovered among the rubble of the student hall, the country grappled with its own horror. The image of the shattered building, the bloodied faces of the survivors, would be seared into the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. The shock, the fear, the disbelief it was a collective wound that would not heal easily. And as the media devoured every shred of information about the four women, there was an undercurrent of something darker creeping into the coverage and understanding, unspoken but undeniable, that this tragedy was not just a random act of violence. It was a consequence, a warning. In the following days, the world watched as the authorities pieced together the final details of the attack, and as the media circus continued to swirl around the tragedy, there was a sense of unease that lingered in the air. The search for the women, their identities, their motives, their history continued, but the sense of dread that followed their actions was unmistakable. It was clear now that the attack was not just a singular event. It was a reflection of something far deeper, a symptom of a world that had failed its most vulnerable. The question that hung in the air, unanswered, was whether the women had been victims or perpetrators, or whether, in the end, they had been both. The survivors, those who had managed to escape the bloodshed, were left to grapple with the trauma of what had happened. They were haunted by the faces of the dead, by the screams, by the sheer violence of it all. Many would never be the same. And the families of the victims, the parents, the siblings, the friends would carry the weight of this loss forever, their lives irrevocably altered by the senselessness of the attack. But even more than that, the questions would linger long after the news cameras had left, long after the rubble had been cleared away. Why had this happened? What had driven these women to such a brutal, unforgivable act? The world would search for answers, but in the end it would be the very question itself that would consume everyone, the question of how, in a world built on so many promises, so many ideals, people could still fall through the cracks. The search for them had dragged on for weeks, stretching into months, but the women, now ghosts in the world they had once inhabited, had vanished without a trace. The chaos they had unleashed was still fresh, still a raw wound that bled through the very fabric of the country. News reports still lingered in the background of every conversation, every public space. The faces of the dead, their names, their stories were still etched into the collective memory. Survivors left in the wake of the destruction were haunted by nightmares of the fire, the screams, the blood. But in the aftermath of terror, there is always a search for closure, a deep need to find answers, to trace the origin of the nightmare. And sometimes that pursuit of answers becomes its own terror. For months, the authorities followed every lead. They investigated every potential hiding place, combed through cities, rural towns, abandoned houses, and places that were nothing more than forgotten corners of the world. The women were nowhere. It was as if they had dissolved into thin air. But there were whispers, rumors, small inconsistencies in reports that began to surface. It wasn't much, but it was enough to set the authorities on edge. Something had shifted. Somewhere, deep in the darkest corners of the nation, the women were watching. They were waiting. Layla was the first to resurface. It had been almost a year since the explosion, since the destruction of the lives they had irrevocably altered, but the itch, the need to finish what had been started, never left her. She had spent the months since the attack hiding, staying in the shadows, but she had never truly vanished. They had failed to capture her. And now, as the heat of the investigation began to fade and the world moved on to new horrors, she saw an opportunity to finish the work that had been left unfinished. Zara, Amina, and Fatima had kept their distance. They had scattered in different directions, each one retreating into their own personal hells, each one trying to escape the weight of what they had done. But even in their isolation, they could feel the pull, the compulsion to come together once again. The four women were bound by something deeper than shared ideology. They were bound by the blood of their victims, by the rage that had fueled their actions. They were ghosts. But ghosts are never truly free. It was in the dead of night that Layla reached out to the others. There were no words, no plans, no formalities. There was only the urgent, desperate pull to reunite, to finish what they had started. They would meet in a place that had no name, no significance, a place that had been abandoned and forgotten by the rest of the world. But it was perfect. It was secluded, away from prying eyes, and its emptiness mirrored the hollow places inside them all. The women would come together once more, as they had all those months ago, when their rage had been a shared, singular force that had ripped through everything they knew. When they met, there was no reunion in the traditional sense. There was no joy in their faces, no smiles to greet one another. They were different now, hardened, each one carrying the weight of their own brokenness. Time had taken its toll. But the mission, the reason they had come together, was clear. The world had forgotten them, had moved on, and so they had to make sure that they would never be forgotten. They had to leave a mark, something so unyielding, so deep, that it would tear through the apathy of a world that had discarded them. They had to make sure their story was never lost. As the night wore on, the tension in the air grew thick. The moonlight filtered through the trees in fractured beams, casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and pulse with a life of their own. They were preparing for something big, something final. And in that moment, as the minutes bled into hours, the sense of inevitability grew stronger. There was no turning back. There was no question of what they had to do. The place they had chosen, a crumbling warehouse on the edge of a forgotten industrial district, was as cold and desolate as they felt. Broken glass and rusted metal littered the ground. The remnants of a world that had once been, now abandoned, like them. No one would come here. No one would witness what would unfold. They were alone, surrounded by the ghosts of their own making. Layla, the leader, stood at the center, her expression unreadable, her heart steady. In her hands she held a map, a final blueprint of what was to come. It was a plan for destruction, one that would leave a scar so deep that no one would forget. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about marking their place in the world, about making the world feel what they had felt all along: ignored, abandoned, overlooked. They had never mattered until they took matters into their own hands, and now they would ensure they would be remembered. Amina and Zara stood at opposite ends of the room, their eyes fixed on Layla. The tension between them was palpable. They had all been irrevocably changed by what they had done. But they understood now, perhaps more than ever, the weight of their shared history. They had done something irreversible. There was no coming back from this. But that didn't matter now. The only thing that mattered was the final act of defiance, the final statement they had to make. Fatima, always the quiet one, moved around them, gathering the last of their tools. There were no words between them. None were needed. Their silence spoke volumes. They knew their roles, and they knew what was at stake. The night air was cool against their skin as they prepared, as they made the final adjustments to their plan. Their movements were synchronized, efficient, but there was a deep undercurrent of something else, something darker. It wasn't fear. It wasn't regret. It was something closer to inevitability. They were simply doing what needed to be done. Their minds were focused, their hearts hard. The world had rejected them, and now it would pay the price. They moved toward their designated positions, each one slipping into the shadows, blending with the darkness. The final moments of silence stretched on, each heartbeat louder than the last. The map in Layla's hand had already been memorized, each step already calculated. It had all led to this point. The final confrontation, the final act. As they set the plan into motion, a sudden sharp noise echoed through the warehouse, breaking the tension. A siren, a single, high-pitched wail, distant but growing louder. The authorities had found them. For the first time, a ripple of panic coursed through Layla's veins. The plan had been flawless. How had they been discovered? Her mind raced. They had made sure to cover their tracks. They had been careful, meticulous, but it was too late. The world was closing in on them. The sirens were growing louder, now joined by the whir of helicopters overhead, the sound of boots on pavement, the rush of men and women who had come to end the nightmare they had started. Layla's breath quickened. This was it. The final confrontation was no longer about the plan, the destruction. It was about survival. It was about facing the consequences of their actions, facing the end of their journey. The women had tried to become something bigger than themselves, but now, with the walls closing in, they were forced to confront the brutal reality of what they had done. In the distance, the flash of lights illuminated the night sky, the colors flickering like a twisted beacon of hope that would never reach them. It was a world of chaos, a world that had begun to suffocate under the weight of their actions. They had made their mark. And now, the world would return the favor. Layla's heart raced as she heard the sound of boots on the gravel. The final confrontation had arrived.